performance and culture, they're quite linked, because the way that you design a performance program really speaks to the design of the culture of your company. But in order to present it, we need to talk about each thing in its course. And on the performance side, I've chosen one very particular subject to talk about, and not everything that goes into how do you manage people and how do you perform. But I've chosen to talk about something that I experienced and lived for almost 7 years with Google, that I think is really the foundation of any very, very strong performance-driven program. So it's called OKRs, and maybe you've heard that before. Has anyone heard the term OKRs? No, 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 no. No one.
No, a few days ago, actually, one guy from Get Your Guide, and we have a video, but we didn't watch it, was like key. It's kind of to measure how well we're doing, but it's objectives driven. It's on the edge of my tongue. Okay, good. Nobody knows it, which actually makes me happier, because then I'm not telling you something you already know, and maybe that makes you more interested. So it stands for objectives and key results. Okay, and the story behind it is actually very, very interesting. So have any of you heard of a guy named John Doerr? I think he was one of the greatest venture capitalists.
Yeah, so he's one of the star venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. He invested in Netscape, in Amazon, in Google. He still sits on the board of Google today. So very influential venture capitalist. He took this methodology from Intel. And actually implemented it at Netscape a long, long time ago, and implemented it at Google. And he did that at a very, very, very early stage in the company. Before the company was even a year old, he came to the company, the office, sat down with Larry and Sergey and a few others that were there, Marissa Meyer probably, and some others, and said, I want to share this with you and suggest that this is the way that you plan your business, okay? So I will admit that I've stolen or copied or taken huge liberty in using words from John Doerr's original deck. And I will also point you to a great video that also goes into further depth about OKRs if you find the subject fascinating. So this is the first slide that he used. Obviously, I've adapted it to my slide format, but this is the content of the first slide that he used. Okay, so this is the format of an OKR. Okay, there's an objective, right? And so this can be the objective for today, if you want, or for the next hour, right? To develop a workable model for planning. And the thing about the objective is that it needs to be extremely clear, right? And that's obviously extremely clear, right? Because it's pretty damn simple. But when you think in terms of your own businesses, you have to think about, what are the key objectives that we're facing in the next 3 months, and how do I make them extremely clear? And then the results, also extremely clear, but more importantly and critically measurable, okay? So he said he's going to finish the presentation on time. I didn't actually look when we started, so I can't promise that, but no. We'll finish the presentation on time. I would love it if we had a small exercise. I see most of you have pens, if not you have an iPhone or something, to try this on your own, okay, and actually write an OKR for your company. And if things really go well, at the end of the workshop, you all commit to trying this for the next 3 months, okay? Because something you have to remember about this performance issue, and also about culture, which we'll go into later, is that it's never too early to start implementing this. In fact, the sooner you implement it, the better it's going to be, Because as time goes by, habits form, and it gets more and more difficult to implement processes like these, because you'll face resistance by people who say, well, we didn't do that before and everything's working fine. Why do we need to have a meeting about this? Or why do we need to write this down? Or why do we need to talk about this? It gets much more difficult. So actually, if you're only 2 people today or 3 people today, you can still do this, and it's going to set the course for the rest of the cycle of your company. Okay?
We are 11.
You're 11, great. So okay, so you as 11 might already see the effects of starting it too late. Okay, because you'll have some people that will probably say, I don't want to do this. Okay, so think about that as we go through the slides. Okay, so why should you do this? There's benefits, obviously, to doing this. There's things around in terms of thinking, right? These are the objectives. You will follow me, right? This is a bottom-up process, or it should be in any case something where the entire company participates, and things are found through the participation of all the company that actually might even change the priorities of the leadership, right? So let me give you an example. And of course, most of my examples are going to be Google, because this comes from Google. That's where I spend all the time, blah, 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 blah. So sorry for lack of diversity. Gmail, right? Most people know that Gmail was a result of 20% project at Google, right? If you didn't know, well, now you know. But what's interesting about it from the performance or OKR perspective is that it actually started as, why can't we search better in email? It wasn't really, let's build a new email interface, let's build search for email. And that evolved over time to become Gmail, and it evolved into being a company-wide priority that this would succeed. And this came from a guy named Paul, and I can't pronounce his last name, but one guy in the company said, I want to do this, and did it, and then it went up. Okay, so it's really involving the whole company, and the goals that are built from the bottom up will then integrate into the overall goal setting of the company and make it much easier for the leadership to get buy-in and have an inspired workforce and an aligned workforce. She's the best with service. Okay, so you have the ability to think about this very carefully. You have the ability to communicate because everybody knows what's important. Now, let me tell you something that will freak you out, okay? This entire process, all of the output of it, all of the content of it is public within the company, okay? So everyone's objectives and key results are visible, okay? Basically, you go onto the internet, you click on anybody's name, and there you see all of their objectives and key results for the current quarter, but also you can see the history, okay? And you can also see the grades of how they did, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But everything's public, right? Which could be scary to some people, right? And probably should be, but that's part of the process and part of the point of doing it. Not only to increase commitment and hold people accountable, but also to have a lot of transparency within the company so people know what other people are working on and therefore can work better together, okay? You are able to measure progress. And if you remember in the first slide, we talked about the key results being measurable. And that's really the key, if you will, to the whole thing, and why also this process was adopted and implemented with such enthusiasm so quickly at Google, because being able to measure was, a core, or still is rather, a core value of the company. Google, if you know any of the history, is the dictionary definition of a data-driven company. everything is driven by data at Google. All decisions are taken by data. So if you wanted something to happen, you would have to be able to show the data, okay? And we'll talk about that again more when we talk about the grading. And then in terms of the effort, it keeps your organization aligned, because everybody knows what the overarching company objectives are, the team objectives, the individual objectives, and everybody's really well set up. Okay, I've done a bunch of work with startups over the past years, and I've done some very interesting projects around auditing the company from the people side, from the employee side. And the project is really to go and talk to a sampling or all, depending on the size of the company, of the employees, and ask them lots of questions about what it's like to work at company X. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What do you think of the management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And every single time that I've done this, one of the questions is, what do you think is the direction of the company? What do you think is the strategy of the company? What do you think is the vision of the company, or where do you think the company is going? And what do you think the answer is?
Everybody's giving a different answer.
Thank you very much. Everybody's giving a different answer. And it's shocking, right? I mean, you as the leadership at your company would hope that everybody knows where you're going. Or else, what are they doing all day long that you're paying for or bribing us for? So it's amazing that that happens. And one of the reasons that that happens is because the direction, the vision, the objectives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are poorly communicated. And you might not think that they're poorly communicated because you think that you've communicated them. Everybody says, well, that's impossible. I've communicated this. We've had a meeting about it, right?
I sent the memo.
I sent the memo, right. But the question really is what's the frequency and what's the style of that communication? Because whether you like it or not, saying something once doesn't embed the message. The people have to hear it over and over and over and over and over again. It has to be in all your communication so that people really understand where they're supposed to be going. And then you have this effect of alignment where people are going in the same direction. And the most mediatized, is that a word? Example from Google, of course, which you may have read because it was so much in the press just a couple of years ago, was the whole thing about social and Google Plus, where hypothetically or theoretically, Larry Page said, everyone in this company will focus on social and will be part of your bonus. Now, is that all true? I actually doubt it to some degree because that's a mandate from the CEO and it doesn't really capture the values of Google. But in any sense, it was a very, very high priority, and how that came into being, I don't know because I wasn't there. But that was something that was very, very clear to everyone. And that's why if you go on Google Plus, if any of you use it, you'll see that everybody at Google is on it. I don't know who else. So let me drink something. Well, whenever you talk to anybody about meetings, they freak out because people don't like meetings. Why don't people like meetings?
Because
you're the only one talking.
I don't like it because most of the time people come unprepared. There is no clear agenda,
yeah.
And it ends up in a waste of time.
Yeah.
And most of the things that do require a meeting can be either communicated via email beforehand and so on and so on.
Okay, so the key there is actually lack of preparation. Right? I mean, there's all hosts of reasons, but basically it's lack of preparation. So yes, having too many meetings is a real pain. And I actually read something that I thought was really, really interesting. I think it was a guy that was appointed head of product at Dropbox, but I could be wrong, who came in and said, we're going to delete all recurring meetings from the calendar and start fresh. And we'll see what happens. And I think it's actually really, really interesting because what happens over time and why people get this feeling of meetings suck is because they just build up and you find you're spending all your days in meetings. So instead, let's wipe them all out, and then the really important, necessary ones will resurface, right? But the idea, the essential of it is that you have meetings to cover important topics where people are prepared, right? And I can spend an hour talking to you about meeting cycles, okay, and how you can make them really useful, but let's stick to the topic. So when you think about communication and meetings in terms of the OKRs, there's two sides. There's the one-to-one meetings where you have with your team members to talk about the key results, right? And to talk about, but also to negotiate the key results. Because it shouldn't be, again, something that management says, this is what you're going to achieve. Because then the person doesn't feel ownership of that. They don't feel like they're making the right contribution. So it's really a discussion, a negotiation about, you know, in order to meet your objective, then what should the key results be, right? And it's something between the manager and the employee, and it also, most importantly, gives a way to monitor progress, okay? Because one thing when I talk to startups that always shocks me is I say, you know, how do you meet with your people, right? Do you have weekly one-to-one meetings? Do you have weekly staff meetings, leadership meetings, team meetings? And most people say, well, you know, we're 3 people, we're 5 people, we're whatever, you're 11 people. We all sit at the same table, so we don't really need to have meetings. And I find that kind of disturbing because if you don't have one-to-one meetings where you sit down with a person and discuss what they're working on, where they're going, what they want to achieve, how they want to develop, you don't know that because you're sitting around a table. People won't share the same things in a group that they'll share one-to-one when you establish trust and confidence in them. So I don't understand how that works. I don't understand how the founders of the company don't get together and have, you know, founders meeting or a leadership team meeting to discuss how the company's operating. At Google, and again, I don't know if this exists today, but I know from the beginning until many, many years into it, Larry, Sergey, and eventually Eric met every Sunday, sadly at Subway, I think it was, to talk about the company and where the company was going in the direction. And that was their time for them to talk about the company and the direction of the company. Of course, it shows commitment that they're working together on Sunday, but this is a 24/7 type of operation. It's always going, but you need to distance yourself on Sunday, the day of rest, to talk about the big picture, the important things. Okay, so I've kind of digressed a little bit, but you know, the idea is that there's some way to monitor progress, and by having this objective and key results statement or document, then you can monitor the progress of that on an individual, a team, and a company level. And there's a slide with a timeline on it a bit there. And then, of course, there's the group, and the same thing is really happening in the group, except you're really talking about the objectives in the group as opposed to the results. Okay, I mean, you're talking about the results, but you're setting the objectives and negotiating the objectives. Okay? Are we good? Is this the right pace? Yep. All right, so here's the timeline, right? And let me just say at this point that when you look at this slide, you're like, oh my God, you know, like, I'm going to spend my life doing OKRs. That's not the point of this at all, okay? So make sure, if there's one huge thing you take away from this about OKRs, it shouldn't be time consuming, okay? Some people get into this planning stuff and spend a lot of time on planning. That's not the idea. The idea is to get the results, right? Not write the plan. So you want to think about doing this in the most lightweight way possible, right? It's to set direction, to measure, and to monitor performance, okay? So this is an example of the timeline. As you'll see, the slide looks different because I also hijacked this slide because I'm not great at PowerPoint. Much easier to have someone else do it for me. But you'll see in the corner there that it comes from Google Ventures Startup Lab. And if you haven't seen anything from those guys, you should take a look because they're putting all types of videos online about these types of things that are relevant to startups. Anyway, so I hijacked that, and it shows you the timeline, and it shows you how it goes up and down in terms of the individuals brainstorming their ideas and then working on that with their teams and their managers and then communicating it to the company, right? So you can see, if you take the example that they've used for the first quarter, okay, they start brainstorming those objectives late November, early December. Because the idea is that you want to be able to have finalized and have commitment around your objectives no later than really the second week into the quarter, or else you've gone way, way too far. But there's a lot of things that are happening because you have the individuals that are rolling up to the leadership, and then the leadership digesting that and relaying that to the company, because you see that there's a company-wide meeting here, right? And so, you know, the individual objectives, you're sharing them, you're negotiating them, discussing them, and then bam, the company is sharing that with you, and then you're kind of finalizing and putting it into place there. The thing that I think is interesting about this is, if you're really serious about it, and think about in your company, which has 11 people, right? So the 11 people are brainstorming and drafting ideas and saying, okay, this is what I want to accomplish for the next 3 months at the company, and then that is spiraling its way up to you or you and your leadership team, and then you say, okay, you know, I have an idea of what my objectives are for the company as the founder, as the CEO. I'm assuming you are, but and then I'm going to integrate everything that I've taken, and I might see some things that actually make sense to build into the overall company objectives, and from that, I'm going to have a meeting with all 11 people, and I'm going to share what the objectives are for the next quarter, but I'm also going to report on the previous quarter, right? And again, when you think about it, you want to share the results with the company. You want to know what people have achieved. So the company meeting might look like, let's talk about the last quarter, let's talk about what went right, what went wrong, what we can do better, and let's talk about how we're going to now move forward for the next 3 months. And involving the people who are responsible for each functional area or product or however you design this. Remember, there's no strict rule book for how you would implement something like this. You need to understand the concepts, and then you need to adapt that to your company. Okay? Okay, so a couple of things about the OKRs themselves, right? Again, this is a lightweight process. So you're not writing a book, right? You're not writing a PowerPoint presentation. You're writing a page, maybe 2 pages. And Google now is doing this all online. And the way that it was described, and I had left by the time it was all online, was something that sounded extremely simple. Basically, an online form that says objective, text field, key result, text field, and then a place for scoring. And the guy said the most advanced thing you can do is average the scores. And that's it. And then you publish it to your intranet page. So you have 5 objectives, 4 key results. This is a guideline. It's a max. The idea is that if you have more, you're going to go crazy because you can't focus feasibly on more than that, okay? But also, think about the fact that the company objectives are going to be different from the team objectives and from the individual objectives. The example that the guy in the video gives is hard for me to relate, and I've been trying to think of a better one, but I'm also struggling with that as well. So his example was about American football, right? Which is a terrible example to use in Europe. So I thought I would use football, which, after 15 years in Europe, I still am not good at following. Sorry, I apologize, don't hurt me. But let's just pretend I know something about it, right? The company goal, right, of the football club is to win the World Cup or the Champions League or whatever you have, right? That's the company goal, right? But the people who are in charge of different parts of the football club, they have different goals, right? So like the coach has his own goals, and the coach says, my team is going to have these statistics, which I can't relate any of them to. But the head of PR is going to have different goals to make people come to the stadium to watch the games, right? So those people have those overarching goals, but then the people who are doing the things, right, are going to have to score the goals or do the passing or do the running or highlight the new players or whatever it is, right? So there's all these different levels, but it's all relatively simple. And again, more than 50% of the objectives should be coming up from the bottom, or else you're leaning your balance more towards a dictatorship. Okay? Something that's really interesting, and I think people, even myself, never fully understood this, is that this isn't something to be used against someone when it comes time to a performance review. A performance review is something completely different. This isn't something to say that, okay, well, you failed on this, so you fail on the performance, because there's a big difference between achieving your results and the effort that you put into the results, and it needs to be kept separate to some extent. The good thing about OKRs, when you start talking about performance evaluation, and we'll talk a little bit about that actually in the second half, in the culture piece, is that by doing OKRs on a quarterly basis, you as an individual have the opportunity to look back and see what you've achieved. And this is massively useful in putting together your performance evaluation to say, well, this is what I set out to do and this is what I did. Okay? The grading system, again, we'll get to it in a slide, but the grading system is important for a couple of reasons. One, the scale used is 0 to 1. Okay? And the idea is that you should be happy with a 0.6 or a 0.7. A 1 is not the goal. And the reason that a 1 is not the goal is because, and I think this is a really important part of the methodology, is that these objectives should be a stretch for you. They should make you feel somewhat uncomfortable. You know that you won't be able to achieve everything, but how else do you push yourself? And therefore, the 0.6 or the 0.7 is a good rating. And I think these ratings and ratings and performance reviews, they're very, very difficult to manage. So you might need to adapt that to your own style. But the idea is, how do you encourage people to build objectives that are a stretch, that will take them out of their comfort zone, that will say, okay, this isn't going to be easy to do, but it's a great challenge and I'm fired up to do it. That's what you want, okay? And then you have to decide at the end of the quarter, if you've worked on things that haven't worked out, do you continue doing those things? And that's also a great way to monitor progress and the direction you're headed, because oftentimes you set forth a goal or an objective and it just stays there. And nobody goes back to think about, well, maybe this isn't working and we should alter the strategy. So the end result of this is that people are working together, they're focused, the organization is aligned, which I think is key, and the company is able to really support itself by the fact that the individuals and the teams are focused on where the leadership wants to go by being included in that effort. The last point there is that they're fun. And this is where you can all laugh, because that's debatable, right? Some people won't like this, right? Some people just won't like it. But think about the benefits, right? Think about the results that you can get from doing this. I personally never sat down to write my OKRs and said, oh, wow, this is awesome. Like, I'm having a great time. You know, that's not the feeling I got. Maybe some people would, but the benefit of it, the thing that's exciting about it, is that you're able to take the initiative to really think about where you need to go, where you're headed, and be able to come back and monitor that afterwards. Okay? So, a couple of small bits on it. So they're set quarterly and annually. Obviously, annually for the year. Measurable, personal, team, company, publicly available, and graded every quarter. The objective, again, and I think, you know, if you capture one slide in your head, let's just capture this one, right? Because this isn't something that you can necessarily just go off and figure out in 5 minutes. You need to go through this again over and over, but you know, the objective is ambitious, it feels a bit uncomfortable. The results make the objective achievable, okay? They're somewhat uncomfortable, you're stretching yourself, and you're able to grade them. This is a recap that we've talked about, what the personal ones are, what the team ones are, what the company ones are, in terms of individual, team, and overall company objectives. Okay? So, just to rehash the grading part a little bit, because everybody grades differently. I found it very, very difficult also from a cultural perspective, because grades mean so many different things in so many different cultures, right? And I think, you know, for me, the best example is France, because I live there and I understand the system to some degree. But the grading culture in France is diabolically opposed to the grading system in the US. Okay? In France, the grading system at school, right, is 0 to 20. And 20 is reserved for God. Okay, so nobody gets a 20. And if you get an 18, you're a demigod, I guess. In the US, the grading system in most places is on 0 to 4. And 4 is for the best people, and the best people get 4s, right? So at school, in the US, you know, your parents or whoever's pushing you wants you to get a 4, right? In France, it doesn't really matter as long as you don't get kicked out. And so the culture of that is totally different. So in France, you would never get a 1 anyway, right? But in the US, the Americans are like, oh my God, I only got 0.6, right? I mean, this is really disturbing to them. Google's performance scale is the same way, 0 to 5. Nobody gets a 5. You have to be a god, right? And if you get a 4, you're a genius, okay? Most people get somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5, or 2.7 and 3.7, somewhere like that, right? But the idea is to put a grading system into place that allows you to, A, collect data. Okay, this is the bottom line of it anyway, because you want to get a sense of, you know, direction. Are we overall making progress here, right? From the aggregate of the scores. Okay, and also, you know, where things aren't working, how do we readjust? Okay, so those are really the important parts about the grading system. Okay. So we talked about this in the timeline, but basically you have to make sure you review it, right? You can't just do it and leave it alone, but you have to review it, and you have to review it one-to-one, you have to review it with the group, and you have to review it as a company, and it should be done quarterly and part of the process that continues the cycle.